Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes from the YFP Facebook group, and the question is, husband and I have been saving for a bigger house, but with rising interest rates, we will likely stay put in our current home for a bit longer, likely a couple of years. We have a large chunk of money sitting in the bank, which I know is doing us no good, especially now since we won't be using it anytime soon like we had planned. We have no other debt other than our house. We have our 401k maxed out. Also not confident in the stock market right now, so hesitant to invest more there. We're considering dumping money on our mortgage with the goal of being debt-free. Is it a wise move to take our forever home house fund money and put it on the mortgage? How much would you keep in the bank? Thanks in advance for any guidance. And further follow-up is that they have 529 plans for the kids, and they're already contributing to them with each paycheck, but wondering if they might want to invest more there as well. Tim Baker, lots going on. I think this really highlights the complexity of the financial plan and how we're often balancing multiple goals. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I'm not even sure where to begin, Tim, to be honest. There's lots of short-term, medium-term, long-term goals.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of avenues to go down and resources to work with. This might be the biggest it depends, we've had. So yeah, I think ultimately, I go back to the balance sheet, which, she's kind of outlined here in terms of the different avenues. But then to me, this is really about a deeper dive into the goals, right? So
Yes.
she mentioned dream home. I think if that is important, like the most important thing on a particular timeline, like, hey, our kids are starting school, or something related to that, so we have to be like we want to be in this neighborhood by then, versus if it's more kind of up to the timeline of the market, so as the market maybe adjusts or interest rates, or it's not as hot, I think that's going to be so important. So like we mentioned in one of these questions previously, with uncertainty, but also with home buying, cash is king. So if you have the cash tied up in your home, because you've directed that towards the current mortgage, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it might not necessarily make your offer as as aggressive as somebody else's, or less attractive as someone else's. So to me, it would be like looking at what's left on the current mortgage, what's the rate. Are we selling this home when we do purchase the dream home? Because obviously that I'm assuming that is the case, because we're basically converting that asset into, and roll that into the next one. We mentioned 529s. I would ask, like, what's the goal there? I bonds are obviously something that we could look at, because right now they're paying 9.62%, Tim. But
Crazy.
that's 20,000. So if we're thinking that we have, I don't know, I'm picking a number, $100,000, that's the dream home pot of money. That's a small percentage of it. So what do we do with the rest? You can talk about the stock market, but right now interest rates are better. So the fixed income market, the bond market, you could potentially find something with a lot less volatility that's paying somewhat of a steady dividend. You could look at TIPS, which is kind of like what an I bond is. It's inflation protected. It's tied to the CPI. Depending on how far out that timeline is, if we kind of get a timeline, we could put some equities in there, which could lose value, but they could also outpace what you would get in a high yield account. So there's just so many questions here, but it's that hard middle ground. It's kind of the no man's land. Is if we're saying, hey, we need this money anytime between like today and a year or two, it's probably something that's I bond, CD, high yield savings, and you get your 1.75% now in a high yield. Woo. You get maybe your 9%, but again, that's locked in for a year for the I bond. Yeah. So if for a previous episode we talked about this, if you buy an I bond today, you can't touch it for 365 days, and then if you touch it between a year and 5 years, you forfeit 3 months of interest, which is not terrible. And then anything beyond 5 years, you're kind of free and clear. So that's a restriction that you might not see in a high yield or even a CD. Typically in a CD, you can get to it, but you're going to, you're going to forfeit some interest. But anything past that like 2 or 3 year mark, you're kind of like, what do we do? Right. Because you want to get a little bit more return, but there's also risk associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
So, a rule of thumb, is like, okay, if it's maybe a 3 year out, maybe we do a 30-70, so 30% in equities, 70% in bonds. And knowing that, you could have some volatility there. The further out we go, Tim, we're talking 10, 20, 30 years, the more aggressive that we can be because we're further away from the time horizon that, so if there's chances, even if the market goes down 20, 30, 40%, that we can recover. So one of the things I talk about when we talk about the history of the S&P 500, if someone says like, hey, I need this money in a year, if we look at the best year in the history of the S&P 500, it's up 53%. The worst year, it's down 37%. In a rolling 5-year period, up 28%, down 12%. Rolling 10-year, up 17, down 4. So it's kind of getting closer and closer. So to me, with kind of the uncertainty around the time horizon, I don't know. Do we just take some of that money and maybe divide it amongst those things? The 529, put a little bit more towards the current mortgage, put some in I bonds, maybe. But then I think you're kind of doing a little bit of a lot of things versus a lot of one thing or two things, which sometimes can be true, is that we have so many objectives that we want to accomplish versus just focusing on one and checking it off, which is hard because, like, again, we're kind of at the whims of the market. If we're at the whims of the market and we're going to say, okay, we're going to let this go until we feel more comfortable, maybe I would say, well, let's get a little bit more aggressive. We put some money in I bonds and probably look to build out a brokerage, a taxable portfolio that is fairly conservative with the risk that we're taking, but there's a little bit of upside. A lot of people think that, something like an I bond is going to do much better than the stock market. The stock market, could be flat, if not down this year. So, you take your 9% and run. But, again, that's going to be a small portion of the overall money, I think, that we're talking about. If it's 20,000 is the cap for, $10,000 each. So more questions than answers. And this is kind of one of the ones that, is there's just so many different moving pieces here. That's short-term, medium, long-term, whether it's real estate, an education goal, retirement. And, they did say they're maxing out 401ks, which is great. But to me, this is kind of like you build the plan and then, it's more about plan in as things come up, we can adapt.
That's right.
The problem with this is that you could put, money in a situation where it's not accessible, or my wife and I were, we were thinking about moving, and we've actually put offers on home and lost them because of a lack of liquidity. So, if you're still opening up Zillow and looking at homes, your timeline's probably going to be a lot more accelerated than you think. So there's the behavioral aspect of this as well. So, to me, this is really where you sit down with your partner. And I think probably the most important thing is to kind of get on the same page with the goals and prioritize, what is the most important thing, and then start building the plan from there. And obviously, biased here, I think having an objective third party to kind of walk you through some of those questions and provide some clarity is going to be super important. But this is kind of, we have a pot of money, here's all the things, like, what could we do? And I think we really need to do a deeper dive in, what is the the goal that we're trying to achieve that's most important, and then go from there.
Yeah, first I saw this question, Tim, I thought, man, this would be an awesome planning client, because this is
no
exactly
doubt
where the value of a third party and taking all these moving parts, coming up with the goals and the framework and the prioritization, and getting clarity on that, moving forward. And this is a great example, but one that's not unique to, what the planning team sees, which is, hey, we're trying to save for retirement. We got maybe kids' college. There's other goals we're not even talking about. We're trying to move or buy a home. Like, lots of things going on. We've got some margin and cash flow, but what's the priority and how do we put these puzzle pieces together? And I think the goals, to me, resonate so much with where to start here, because one of the things, and I think you articulated it well, is like, this situation, as I hear it, is really kind of reacting to the market in terms of when we're going to move into our forever home. And if that goal is that important and it's the number one goal, and we're on track and checking off all these other boxes, you've talked about before on the show that we've got to develop a financial plan that allows us to yes, save for the future, but we also have to live a rich life today, right? So like, should that be driving, the way it is? Or if we're on pace with everything else, like might we have a little bit of freedom and margin despite rates being where they're at in the moment to pull the trigger and make that move shorter term, rather than longer term. Other thing I think about here too is just like, what's the rate on the current home? So,
Right.
to your comment about liquidity, if we have a mortgage at 3% and we can get 1.75% in a long-term, high yield savings account, like, there's not a whole lot of difference there. Obviously, the numbers add up, but one is liquid and accessible, and obviously the other is not if it's tied up in the mortgage, at least to some capacity. So
Yeah, and if we use the example that if you have 100,000 and 20,000 of that is going into a 9, and then you can kind of look at a composite rate, you probably are beating the rate that you're going to put towards, the current mortgage, right?
yeah,
So that's kind of the question is like, if the mortgage rate is 3.5%, can we do better that, in the market? Probably even in the short term,
yeah,
just because of where interest rates are. But you don't know. And to me, that's the thing is like typically with uncertainty, you want to hold on to the cash. But we're also talking about like, well, if there is a longer time horizon, we want to get a little bit more yield. And that's kind of the
hmm
hard place that we're stuck
yeah,
in is and that's why I think it's really important to unpack the goals and to come up with a plan. And then again, it's kind of like, you get punched in the mouth, this happens, and then, it's the act of planning and to adapt
yeah.
and call an audible that, allows us to kind of, proceed and make sure that we're kind of keeping, first things first. So yeah, this is a tough one. And yeah, same thing. I would love to be able to get in the room with this couple and kind of break it down and then ask some good questions and then provide kind of some clarity to move forward. But there's just so many, moving pieces here.
One other factor just to throw into the mix to make this, a little bit more complicated is, we heard in the question that there's 529 savings, there's 401k savings. So, depending on where we're at in terms of, the nest egg and tracking with retirement savings, is there an opportunity for, I'm thinking about some post-tax Roth, HSA, like is that another vehicle that, again, another puzzle option, right, among many. So,
Yeah, I mean, if we were to do a nest egg and we were saying, hey, you guys are doing very well for, the version of yourself 30, 40 years from now, if we assume that they're, a younger couple that are going to retire. Yeah, I mean, that could be an option too. I mean, there's just so many different
yeah,
ways to kind of look at this. And, to me, I think it kind of goes back to, what is most important and then kind of align the strategies with that, knowing that, we may need to be flexible because, things change over time. So it's just a tough question. And these types of questions are literally the things that we work through with clients
yeah,
because it's typically a lot of these questions that are asked on this segment it is very a siloed question, although we might say, hey, this is like systems of the body. They're very interconnected, but it might bleed over into this or that. This one literally almost has everything,
yeah.
because of just what was brought up. So this is really where you're trying to bring all the pieces together and then find out the best path forward. And unfortunately, like it's not something that you can find in a textbook.
hmm
There is a lot of art and along with the science that that we're doing with the plan, which is cool, but it also can be frustrating if you're not very financially literate or you
yeah.
just just so much there's just so much stuff out there, so it can be a little bit paralysis by analysis as well.
Great stuff, Tim. And for folks that enjoyed this discussion and maybe got you thinking about your own plan and the multiple variables going on, Tim and the planning team have been doing an awesome segment on our main show, which we publish on Thursdays, where they're breaking down a case study of an avatar client that's working through many different goals and different phases of life. So you can check out those case studies. We'll link to some of those in the show notes. Again, that's on the YFP podcast that we publish each Thursday. So, for folks that are not part of the YFP Facebook group where this question came from, I hope you will join that group. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. That group is a little over 8,000 pharmacists all across the country that are engaging with one another with financial questions, challenges, wins, a great community of individuals that are empowering and supporting one another. If you have a question that you'd like us to feature on an upcoming episode, you can send us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You can also record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask YFP. And as we wrap up this week's episode, an important reminder that the content in the show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks for listening. Have a great rest of your week.